Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, the Civil War came to an end for Jubal Early. Now we move into a period of his life just as influential on American history, Reconstruction, and we discuss Early's role in the Lost Cause. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Jubal Early took part in no surrender ceremony, and still determined to prosecute the war. With Lee's army surrendered, and the Army of Tennessee under Joseph E. Johnston doing the same in late April, Early struck off for the Trans-Mississippi Department in search of Edmund Kirby Smith and his army. Word circulated that Smith was still prosecuting the war, and Early was determined to join it. As he moved through Alabama, he got word that Smith had surrendered. Early would write, "I was determined not to give a parole or take the oath either, and rode all the way in arms as if I had been in the enemy's country." Early reached Texas in August 1865 and wanted to go to Mexico, but the area around the Rio Grande was hazardous due to bandits and guerrillas, so Early waited for months in order to find a space on a ship to take him to Mexico. It was December before he arrived in Veracruz. The journey hadn't been easy. The ship first went to Nassau, Bimini, and Cuba before arriving in Mexico. In Nassau, Early bought a gray suit that sported Confederate Army buttons, one of many he would wear in his lifetime, a civilian version of his Confederate uniform. Early hoped to convince Emperor Maximilian, the French ruler of Mexico, to prosecute a war with the United States and offer his services to that country in order to keep the Civil War going. However, Maximilian wasn't interested in fighting a war with the United States. He had too many problems at home and abroad to launch a full-scale war with another nation. After just 3 months in Mexico, Early declared the country an infernal humbug and decided to move to Canada to be closer to home and his old comrades. But the move would take months. It was August 1866 before Early settled into Niagara, just across the Canadian line from New York. However, the closeness also brought with it a problem for Early. Early wrote to Jedediah Hotchkiss that he could see the Yankee Fort Niagara, at which the cursed old flag, which always reminds me of a barber's pole, untwisted and ironed out, is always flying. Early found it difficult to live in Niagara, or anywhere in Canada, because he couldn't practice law like he had in the United States without a 5-year probation. He had to rely on the charity of his family, who were, like all Southerners, suffering from the economic damage brought about by the Civil War. Early moved to Toronto in the fall, and it's there he published his first campaign history of the Valley Campaign. Early heard about Robert E. Lee asking President Andrew Johnson for a pardon, and although the former Army commander was trying to set an example for other Southerners to follow, Early saw it as admitting that the Southerners had committed a mistake in fighting the war, and so Early resisted any semblance of behaving as if he was in the wrong. In 1867, word from his family told him that there was speculation to name him as the governor of Virginia. Early wrote back that his temper would doom him for such an office. "If I were made governor, I would have the whole state in another war in less than a week, so it is idle to talk about it, even if there were any prospect of my election. Besides, it was simply impossible for me to accept a pardon, a prerequisite to holding office." As one of his biographers explained, Johnson's policy was to appoint provisional governors in the former Confederate states which were to be brought back into the Union. To accomplish this, conventions called by the governors were to amend the state's antebellum constitutions so as to enfranchise most of the same white men who had been voters before 1861, as long as they swore an oath of loyalty to the United States. Among those disfranchised were former Confederate leaders like Early and men worth $20,000 or more. Like Lee, such notables had to apply personally to President Johnson for their pardons. Early utterly rejected these terms. For him, there was only shame for the South in its state's forced repudiation of everything their governments had done since the outbreak of the war. Early watched Virginia politics incredibly close. Congress and the radical Republicans in it took over Reconstruction from Johnson. Through the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, they established 5 military districts to watch over the former seceded states. The state of Virginia called together its constitutional convention to fall in line with Congress's prerequisites to return into the Union. The convention was led by Judge John C. Underwood and Governor Henry Wells, who worked together, passing the 14th and 15th Amendments, giving African Americans full citizenship in giving African American males the right to vote. Early fumed at one of the provisions laid out in the Constitution that allowed black men to sit on juries, especially since all former federal or state officials who had enlisted in the Confederate cause were disenfranchised. In December 1868, the lame duck president Andrew Johnson issued an unconditional amnesty, and although it technically excluded high-ranking officers like Early, it was intended to pardon all combatants against the United States during the war. Early wrote of the pardon, "Looking upon this proclamation as a final acknowledgment by the government of its inability to hold us responsible under the laws and Constitution as they stood for our resistance to their usurpations and encroachments, I accept it in that light and not as a pardon for any offense committed. I think I can now return without any compromise of principle, and it is certainly a great deal better for me to do so than to remain a burden in the hands of friends who have to submit to the ills of Yankee rule in order to be able to furnish the means on which I live." Before the pardon from Johnson arrived, Early was living in Drummondville in Montreal. It appears at this time Early had a falling out with his girlfriend Julia, whom he had children with. It's only speculation as to why they broke up. Maybe it was his long absences during and after the war, or maybe she found a new suitor. She married a man named Charles Pugh in 1871. That relationship could have begun around this time. Early wrote to a friend, "I wish never to hear of her again. That matter did me a great deal of injury at the time, but I tried to do the best I could. I have felt deeply concerned about the children, but the conduct of their mother has been such as to leave me in no doubt about which might and which might not be. The whole thing is the source of the deepest regret to me, but I certainly, to do any good, and must take their course." Early finally returned to Virginia in July 1869, settling in Lynchburg. Virginia looked different politically than when Early left. Some of his old comrades in gray were cozying up with Republicans, particularly William Mahone, someone that Early would fight in a war of words and actions throughout the rest of their lives. Mahone served in the Army of Northern Virginia, becoming most prominent as a division commander in A.P. Hill's Corps. Early commanded Mahone's division when he temporarily commanded that corps during the Overland Campaign. Mahone in the post-war years befriended the Republicans and even supported some of their initiatives, putting him on the wrong side of Early. Republicans in general supported civil rights for African Americans. Early's stance as a Democrat was against the adoption of civil rights for African Americans. Going further, Early, even though slavery was dead, continued to advocate for its benefits and defended the institution of slavery that existed in the antebellum period. He would write, "If slavery has so tutored the African American that immediately his bonds are loosened, he is qualified for the privileges of the ballot box, what a civilizing tendency that institution must have had." When a bronze statue to Stonewall Jackson was to be unveiled, black militiamen were to march in the procession. Many Confederate leaders approved, including James Kemper, Early's Mexican War friend and a Confederate brigadier general who was wounded in Pickett's charge. He was also the governor of Virginia when the unveiling was to take place. Early said that the militiamen would flaunt pictures of Abraham Lincoln and promote the 15th Amendment. Thinking that Early's presence would cause violence, Kemper wrote to him saying, "For the sake of the public peace and harmony, I beg, beseech, and implore you, for God's sake, stay home." By 1876, Early was having difficulty providing for himself financially. His law practice didn't get a lot of business in Lynchburg, but it allowed him to live without much obligation to anyone else. However, in 1876, he would get a job that would give him secure independence for the rest of his life. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard came to New Orleans after the war to start his own businesses. When the state of Louisiana chartered a lottery, the Louisiana State Lottery Company approached Beauregard to be one of 2 lottery supervisors. When Beauregard accepted, he got to choose the other supervisor. He chose Wade Hampton, the former cavalry commander, but he was running for governor of South Carolina. Hampton said he would take the position if he lost, but he won. Beauregard's second choice was Early, who he offered the position to in December 1876. Early would accept. It came with a base salary of $5,000, and he would have to travel to New Orleans once a month on a 16-hour train ride from Lynchburg. He and Beauregard would preside over the lottery drawing and act as the face of the company, ensuring the people that all was legitimate. They would hold their positions until 1894, when the company packed up and moved to Honduras. Early used the salary from the lottery as a way to direct his attention to his true passion, development of the Southern lost cause. As one of Early's biographers explained, a source of distress was the fact that Southerners were Americans, steeped in the unique American legend of success and victory. Until 1865, no white Americans had ever had to come to grips with a total collective failure. History, to paraphrase Arnold Toynbee, had always been something unpleasant that happens to other people. Suddenly, Southerners were America's other people. As the decades passed, some shed the illusions of fulfillment and innocence once shared with their Northern brethren. Some did not, but all faced the same unpleasantness. For those like him who held back from learning the lesson, resistance to history's chastisement could obviously not extend to the resumption of armed hostilities. The struggle that was waged perforce evolved into a largely unsuccessful attempt to handle the psychological trauma of defeat. The effort became known as the Lost Cause. In this effort to deal with the trauma of defeat, Early took a prominent role. The Southern Historical Society was created to document, compile, and disseminate what Early and others regarded as the true story of the war. The doctrine held that the Confederate soldier was a better fighter than its Union counterpart, and that the Union Army was in some way un-American because of its use of immigrants in the Army's ranks. The idea of the Southern soldier being superior to the Northern one made its declaration that the South was simply overpowered by superior numbers, and that if it was a fair fight, that the South would have won because of their own superiority. Within this construction of the Southern soldier in the public mind, lost causers lifted up Robert E. Lee to demigod status. One of Early's biographers explained, "Seen as a Christ-like figure, Lee acquired an image of moral purity and martial perfection that raised him, and by association all male white Southerners, above the level of ordinary men. Such an image was an eloquent denial of defeat. Lee could be trodden down by barbarians, but was ultimately invincible. A society that could produce such a man, it was strongly implied, could do no wrong." Lee's demigod status and near perfection allowed lost causers to attack an enemy from within as the reason for the South's demise, James Longstreet. They blamed him for delaying the attack at Gettysburg on July 2nd. When Longstreet criticized Lee about Gettysburg, that was another strike against Longstreet, and then he joined the Republican Party after the war, which made men like Early see Longstreet even more as stabbing the Confederacy in the back. Although Early didn't start the Southern Historical Society, he took over as vice president of its Virginia contingent when Robert E. Lee passed away, and in 1873, at a meeting with 22 delegates in Virginia, Early was elected president of the Southern Historical Society. As president, Early packed the society and its executive committee full of Virginians. He believed that Virginia did and still should take a prominent role in the Confederacy's history and its memory. When the Southern Historical Society papers became the outlet for the Society's publications, in its first year, 29 articles were written on the Army of Northern Virginia, with only 4 devoted to armies elsewhere. During Virginia's secession convention, Early battled against secessionists who cited Lincoln's threat to slavery as their main reason for wanting to leave the Union. Early shot back at them by saying that the high number of non-slaveholding whites would be negatively affected by secession. Despite his own battles against slaveholders in the secession convention, Early and other founders of the Lost Cause realized the Confederacy's noble struggle would be dashed if linked with slavery. They began to pivot more towards Southern independence as the righteous cause it talked about so often. They cited the American colonies that broke away from Great Britain, and even some went further, stating that the South, breaking away from the Union, was even more noble than what the colonies did. Within weeks after Robert E. Lee passed in 1870, Early and others began an effort to raise funds to build a statue to their fallen commander. Some tried to get Mrs. Lee to allow them to bury the general in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, but the family wanted him buried in Lexington, Virginia. Eventually, it would be worked out that a mausoleum to Lee would be built at Washington and Lee University, but a statue would be placed in Richmond. Early led the largest effort to memorialize Lee, and even got the Ladies Lee Monument Association to throw their funds in with Early's initiative, which by then was state-sponsored. In January 1872, Early delivered a speech in Lexington, Virginia in honor of Lee's birthday. In it, he extolled Lee's Christian virtue, chivalrous life, and his military cunning. He focused militarily on the Overland Campaign to expound upon Lee's prowess as commander. Unwilling to believe that Lee could be defeated, Early spoke of Lee's superiority over his antagonist in all the qualities of a great captain and of the Confederate soldier over the Northern. General Lee had not been conquered in battle, but surrendered because he had no longer an army with which to give battle. In 1883, part of the monument movement came to fruition, the unveiling of the statue of Lee in the Memorial Chapel in Lexington, Virginia. Early presided over the unveiling. The equestrian statue took longer and had a lot more obstacles to cross for Early. For one, the Ladies Lee Monument Association members wanted a French sculptor to construct the statue, but Early wanted a Virginian. The ladies won that battle. As the cornerstone and pedestal were being laid, Early found that the pedestal was made from granite mined in Maine. He didn't want a Yankee stone to be used for, in his view, the greatest Virginian statue. Lee's nephew and now Governor of Virginia, Fitzhugh Lee, wrote to Early that the main part, probably 19/20ths of the stone used in the pedestal, is Virginia granite, and only this facing stone is made from stone from abroad, so be as quiet as you can. To a Virginian the contract was awarded, and the association saves over $10,000 by it. Send us another 10,000, and I won't tell anyone how high you have been rearing. The statue was unveiled on May 29, 1890, in front of a crowd estimated to be between 100,000 and 150,000. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston helped unveil the statue of his old friend. Early toiled for years to raise the funds all over the South for the statue's construction, and he felt great joy at seeing it stand as a symbol to all to how much he and many others thought of Lee, his life, and his military career.